Unmatched coverage of UGA in the postseason. Brought to you by R.S. Andrews, Kroger, Royal Caribbean, and Georgia Farm Bureau.
And DawgNation, welcome back to another postseason coverage. I'm Kaylee Mansell with Connor Riley. And in the midst of college football, whatever you had planned for today, whatever ideas we had for the show, obviously they have to be scrapped because the biggest news in college football, probably in the past decade, broke yesterday. And of course, that's none other than Nick Saban's retirement. I don't think anybody could have put it into better perspective than my friend Jeff Santel. I put something out on social media yesterday. We were in the studio together about to film Before the Hedges, and he looked at me and he said, Kaylee, for the rest of your life, you were always going to remember where you were and what you were doing when Nick Saban retired. I want to go ahead and bring in Connor Riley. Connor, what was your initial reaction to seeing that come out yesterday?
That feels a little dramatic to say you're always going to remember that.
I feel like you will, though. It was kind of like, I'm not going to want – it can't compare it to when Kobe Bryant passed, but, like, it was one of those moments, like, I'll always remember where I was when I got that news. And I feel the same way about the Nick Saban thing. You have to let that sink in.
I was sitting on my couch and instantly started writing a story and then very quickly got us up on the air to talk about it on DawgNation. I mean, again, it's one of those things, you know, you knew the end was close with Nick Saban, but you never really knew when. And I think Saban was smart in the sense of never really forecasting it, because obviously that's something that could have been used against him on the recruiting trail and impacted his ability to lead Alabama. And I think in some of the statements he has made since then, it is clear that he felt he could no longer do this job to the best of his abilities. And I think there's something to be said about him wanting to go out on top. I think this is one of his better coaching jobs that he had this season, even not winning a national championship. And it's hard not to look at what has happened to his former coaching mate, Bill Belichick in New England, and see him going out with a 4-win season. I don't think Saban is wired to want to go out that way. And so I think for him, he's decided, let's leave this party an hour early rather than leave it an hour too late.
It was interesting because when you and I were at the Orange Bowl, we did a segment together and we both gave our perspectives on the Nick Saban retirement. I thought that he might retire if he won a national championship. And you made the point that you thought he would retire if they didn't, because at that point, what more do you have to give? And so going back and watching that, I did want to give you the credit for it. But now the big question is the domino effect of where this is going to lead other coaching programs. For a lot of people on social media, this always happens to me. It's the ghost of my apartment. We're going to get some ghost hunters in here and maybe shut it down one day. But they love to come after my Wi-Fi stream, specifically when I'm on Restream. But the domino effect that it's going to cause with coaching programs everywhere, because when a coaching position for a top-tier program becomes open, you've got to go get another good coach from a top-tier program. I don't think that Alabama is going to want to take a coordinator. I think they're going to want to take an already established head coach. Social media just seemed to think that Dan Lanning was the guy, but allegedly Dan Lanning called a meeting in with his players and said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stay here with you guys. We don't know whether that's true or not, but it looks to be the way things are going. So with Lanning out, who do you think that Alabama might be after?
Yeah, there's no need for allegedly. Lanning has come out and said he is staying at Oregon and not taking the Alabama job. I think there are 3 names to me that really jump out with Lanning moving on. I do agree with you that it'd be hard to see Alabama hiring a coordinator for this job. I think that would rule out Tommy Rees, their current offensive coordinator, and that would rule out Glenn Schumann, Georgia's defensive coordinator, who is an Alabama alum and has worked there. I think the 3 names that jump out for a variety of reasons are Steve Sarkisian of Texas, Mike Norvell of Florida State, and Dabo Swinney of Clemson. I think if you're Sarkisian, you've seen what Alabama can do there with the infrastructure. He understands what it takes to win there, was the offensive coordinator there for that 2020 team, and was really, I think, instrumental in winning that last national title for Alabama there. The reason why he wouldn't take that job is I'm not certain that Alabama's a better job than Texas. He's already the head coach at Texas. And so because of that, I'm just not so certain that he would leave for a worse job, even if Alabama is willing to pay him top dollar there. Dabo, look, he's an Alabama alum. Things have not been going great at Clemson of late, and I do think that there's probably a part of him that would love a fresh start, along with the ability to come and win at his home school. He's an alum there at Alabama. was a walk-on at that program. That undoubtedly means a lot to him. I think you've seen the impact that Kirby Smart winning at his alma mater has had. Jim Harbaugh at Michigan doing the same thing there. But Dabo Swinney's not a win the press conference hire, and you've already seen Alabama fans sort of push back against that. And I will say, look, Saban brought incredible stability to the University of Alabama, had everyone rowing in the same row. One of the big things you hear in college sports today is the term alignment. And with Saban, that was there. With Dabo, first time they lose a game, second time they lose a game, if Dabo's putting his foot down and not taking a player out of the transfer portal, as Clemson has not done for another season to this point, I think that is something that makes it an interesting hire, and they would probably need a few guys to say no to consider that. But again, Dabo's won 2 national championships. And then Mike Norvell, again, maybe not as established as some people would like to see, although he's, I think, done a little bit more than Dan Lanning has. Leads Florida State to a 13-0 record this season. Obviously has some things not go his way at the end of the year. But I think with the way he rebuilt that Florida State program from where it was when he took over, his ability to mine the transfer portal and also win some big recruiting battles, is familiar with recruiting the South, specifically the state of Florida there. And he's someone who, given what we've seen with Florida State and the uncertainty with that program, might be motivated to make that move from Florida State to Alabama. So I think those are the 3 big names right now to know for that job.
So I have a few thoughts based on the candidates in which you think. Number one, with Dabo, I think if this position would have come open a year ago, it would be an entirely different conversation. But we haven't been able, or he hasn't been able to adapt to the new way of college football, transfer portal, NIL. So you saw the video that was posted on Barstool last night of everybody crowded around the Nick Saban statue with Coke bottles and oatmeal cream pies saying anybody but Dabo. And I think that speaks volumes. And then when it comes to Sarkisian, I think you hit the nail on the head. Texas is a program that, in my mind, has similar resources to Alabama. I think the programs are very comparable. And I think since they're coming into the SEC this year, that's such a gateway for him to establish his own self. Everybody keeps saying you don't want to be the guy after the guy. And I could kind of see that for Sarkisian, especially since they're coming to the SEC. And now with Alabama, maybe not being a big contender, this is a huge opening for Texas. So I'm curious to see what they do. But if you're a Georgia fan, who do you not want to see as the head coach?
I'm of the belief that this was so much a Saban-driven thing. And, yes, Alabama has won a lot. And before Saban, obviously, with Bear Bryant, Gene Stallings won a national title there. I don't know if there's anyone that jumps to mind here that would be scared or worrying. I think maybe a lot of people were hoping that Dan Lanning wouldn't take this job because, one, I think a lot of people look fondly on Dan Lanning given his time here and what he did for that 2021 defense. But I don't think that there's anyone that jumps to mind. I think D'Amico Ryans is certainly an interesting name, but I'm skeptical that he's going to leave the Houston Texans and C.J. Stroud to take that job there. Kaylee, you're, I think, a much bigger Georgia fan than I am. What's the name that scares you?
I think it's not really a matter of – I don't think I'm really scared of anyone to take that position because, if anything, whoever takes that position needs to be fearful that the first SEC matchup that Alabama is going to play is Georgia. So, for me, the curiosity here is what type of coach do you want? Do you want – not really an up-and-comer, but a younger guy who's more energetic, who's been able to adapt to NIL and the transfer portal, somebody like Dan Lanning, or do you take someone that's a little bit older and more reserved and established? For me, I think it comes down to those two things. What's the biggest thing that you want out of a coach?
Not answering the question. You're learning from BA very well there. I think, again, you look at specifically college basketball here as well, because you've seen some of the greats in that sport retire recently. Mike Krzyzewski, Roy Williams of North Carolina, and Jim Boeheim of Syracuse. There is some of that too here with Nick Saban. And so I think, the transfer portal, re-recruiting a roster every year, that clearly wears on guys. And I think so someone like Saban, you can understand him as well. I think using this with the SEC expanding and moving to a 12-team playoff recently, the ability to transfer multiple times looks like that's going to end up passing. So I do think that the timing of this is certainly interesting. I think a guy that would be interesting, and let's point out here as well, no one saw USC hiring Lincoln Riley 2 years ago. No one saw LSU hiring Brian Kelly to do so. Alabama's got as deep pockets as anyone, and I think they understand and know they have to make this hire right, given the difficulty in terms of what this new SEC is going to look like and what really the sport of college football is going to look like. So there's probably some names out there that maybe we're not even discussing or considering right now. I know I threw out a couple of joke names on there on the DawgNation telecast last night, but like Deion Sanders would be interesting to me. Obviously, he has a relationship with Nick Saban. I think Nick Saban is still going to be involved in the Alabama program somehow. Obviously not in a day-to-day aspect like he traditionally has been, but I think there are some surprise names out there that we're not really considering right now that Alabama is going to make an obvious push for.
All right, let me go back on that. Let me rephrase that since Connor drank his sassy, sarcastic juice this morning and it's just rolling today. Truthfully, I'm not fearful of anyone taking on that role because the only person I would be scared of taking that job would be Kirby Smart. Kirby is now the best head coach in college football, without a doubt, and I don't think he has any intention of leaving Georgia. I would take Kirby over any coach out there, even the ones that we're not discussing. So truthfully, as a fan, but also from a different perspective, I'm not fearful of anyone taking that job. So you can go ahead and put your words back in your mouth. I know what you're trying to do here. So we're going to move on. We're going to transition this into Alabama now has a 30-day period for their players to leave the portal. Do you think that UGA would be interested in going to get any of those players?
100%. I think, Caleb Downs is the one that jumps to mind there. Alabama safety freshman, SEC freshman of the year. Someone Kirby spoke glowingly about before the game, and then the cameras caught him, sharing a moment with Downs after the SEC championship game. I think that's probably the biggest one to know. I know a lot of people are going to want to say Justice Haynes, but I think Georgia likes what it has in its running back room entering this season. The guy that, if Downs is, the Kirby want, Jaheim Oates, I believe, the defensive tackle for them, maybe the need that Georgia wants. They obviously want to get better on the defensive line there. Georgia's done a great job of developing defensive linemen over the years. And if a guy like that goes into the portal, Georgia has said they don't want to spend big in NIL, and they've mostly backed that up. Jaheim Oates might be a guy that you actually go out there and do that because of what he means and how he can be a centerpiece of a defense. I know there are people that have thrown out Caden Proctor, the promising young left tackle there. Elijah Pritchard is also a name to know. If anyone on this Alabama team wants to go into the portal, and there certainly will be guys that elect to do so, Georgia's recruited a lot of these guys. Alabama's won a lot of big recruiting matchups against Georgia, so there is some familiarity there with a lot of the players on this roster. And I think this is a big reason why it's so important for Alabama, not just to get this hire right, but to get it hired right in a quick manner. You've already seen 5-star wide receiver Ryan Williams decommit. If I had to bet today, he ends up at Auburn because of this move. And so, look, the clock is ticking here. The dead period for recruiting ends on Friday, and teams are going to be able to start having people on campus. For the 2025 recruiting cycle, which I know feels forever away from right now, if you don't have your ducks in a row this weekend, it's going to make things very, very difficult to try and catch up to what Georgia has already been doing. They signed the number one class this last cycle. So Alabama, because of the roster considerations, and now players have 30 days to make their decision, and they're going to wait to see who gets hired before ultimately making that. Alabama's got its back up against a wall to not just make this hire quickly, but make the right hire quickly as well.
I think one thing that you mentioned is something that I wanted to bring up, and it slipped my mind. You talk about how you've got to get somebody quick to be able to have your ducks in a row. When do you think Alabama's going to have this decision made if they haven't made it already?
I believe the reporting from John Talty and Matt Zenitz, who are two of the best guys who cover Alabama, have said, from, I guess, whenever the announcement was made on Wednesday, that Alabama wants to have this hire done in 72 hours. And now I'm doing quick math here, which is always dangerous. But I believe that would be by Saturday. Realistically, I think if you could have this hire done by Friday, that would be the most ideal situation. But that's a time crunch. And look, Alabama and Jimmy Sexton, the super college agent, have probably already done some vetting on this job in terms of what needs to go into it, salary and things like that. But the longer that this drags on, part of me thinks back to that Tennessee coaching search, and I believe it was 2017, where they bring in Chiano, and then there's the fan base revolt. And then from there, it takes a while to bring in the head coach and Jeremy Pruitt ultimately. I think if Alabama, the longer that this drags on, I think the tougher it is for Alabama and whoever that ultimate next guy is to get things going, because you can already understand that vultures are going to be circling, looking to pick apart that Alabama roster, just given how talented it is.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get a quick hitter from you. What program benefits the most from Saban being gone?
You could make a case for Georgia. I'm going to say it's Auburn, though, with
Yeah.
Hugh Freeze. They're a year ahead in terms of having a new head coach in. I think they understand the issues there with what they're doing. And you look at a team going head-to-head against Alabama. They've won some recruiting battles in this recruiting class in the 2024 cycle. But Auburn just needs more talent. And Alabama did a great job of stockpiling talent, especially in a state like Alabama, which is a better high school football state than I think a lot of people maybe understand or realize. And so while Georgia certainly benefits in some regards simply by not having to see Nick Saban in the SEC championship or in a national championship, for a team that plays Alabama every single year, I think Auburn is a big winner. And there were a couple of friends that were sending the Michael Scott fire safety office gift when Saban eventually announced that he was retiring.
So how about Auburn fans rolling what's left of Toomer's Corner anyway when they find out that Saban retired? What do you think about that? Is it disrespectful, or is that just the epitome of what college football rivalries are?
It's college football. That's ultimately what it is. Be careful what you wish for. The Miami Heat went from Pat Riley to Eric Spoelstra. The San Francisco 49ers went from Joe Montana to Steve Young. We've seen greatness be able to transcend multiple eras before. Taylor Swift with her very many records, I would say going from something like 1989 into Reputation is underappreciated, although at the time people did not understand Reputation as an album. And some would argue still don't. I think that, just because Saban is leaving, and he is unquestionably, in my mind, the greatest coach to ever do it, does not mean that Alabama cannot go around and hire a championship caliber coach. I think as we've seen, it's harder to sustain greatness in this current era of college football where it's just harder to hoard talent. But they can absolutely, in my mind, go out there and find a championship caliber coach. They certainly have the money, facilities, and want to go ahead and do that.
So I do want to backtrack to the transfer portal because we kind of got a little sidetracked there. You mentioned you already have a 5-star wide receiver decommit as soon as the news comes out. Do you think that we will see more kids decommit?
I think so. I think that, for a lot of the guys that are committed for that 2025 cycle, I know Mason Short, an offensive tackle out of Augusta that Georgia is pushing very hard for, is certainly a name to monitor from the Georgia side of things. I think anytime there's a coaching change, look, you can say you want to go to the school and whatnot, and that's certainly understandable, and you commit to the school, not a coach. But Saban was such an icon and so important there. And the one real, thread line, the invisible string, if you will, that kept that Alabama program from what it was, where in his time as the Alabama head coach, he had more first-round draft picks, 44, than he had losses, 29. And so I think
that is the most Connor Riley stat I've ever heard.
You can understand why I think kids that are committed to Alabama right now, especially for that 2025 cycle, are going to be a little skeptical and hesitant and rethink this thing in terms of where they're going. And obviously that doesn't just include guys that are committed to Alabama, but players that were considering Alabama as well. And I think that's an area where Georgia can really stand to benefit.
And in the midst of all this, this could be just completely out of left field and just not even a possibility, but you have breaking news this week with Georgia. You get a quarterback commitment in Jayden Maiava, and then all of a sudden you wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and he's no longer a Georgia Bulldog, and it comes as a shock to the world. But we all know that Kirby likes to have 4 quarterbacks in that quarterback room. He's done it for years now. Could Kirby potentially go out and get somebody like a Dylan Lonergan? Because obviously I don't think he's going to go for a Jalen Hurts. I think out of the Alabama quarterback room that would be the most viable option.
Well, Jalen Hurts is currently.
I know. As soon as I said it, As soon as I said it, Jalen Milroe. My bad. I made a mistake, guys. Connor makes me nervous sometimes.
I'd be pretty impressed if he could pull if he found a way to get Jalen Hurts on this roster.
He might have a year of eligibility left or something.
With how Jalen Hurts and the Eagles have been playing lately, I don't know if you want that. Lonergan is certainly an interesting name. I know Georgia in that 2023 recruiting cycle really prioritized Arch Manning as the quarterback in that class, and they ultimately don't end up taking one. It's interesting, and this is probably a good point to talk about the Maiava news and him ultimately flipping to USC. It's difficult to bring in a transfer quarterback, in my mind, for this Georgia quarterback room because Carson Beck is your clear and obvious starter. I don't know how many quarterbacks coming back next season are better than him. It is certainly less than a number of fingers I have on my left hand. And so I think from there, it's all right, who is a guy that has multiple years of eligibility left, has the athletic gifts and tools that can work at a place like Georgia, wants to come in and sit for a full year and then also have to compete against a guy in Gunnar Stockton who we know this Georgia coaching staff really, really likes.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very difficult needle to thread. And so because of that, I think that's why the fact that you have someone like Maiava, who nobody really paid attention to prior to the visit that he took to Georgia last week. And so I think it'll be interesting moving forward. Is there someone who sort of fits those boxes of multiple years of eligibility left, can be a developmental player, while also still having those athletic type gifts to where if they do need to get pressed into action, they can go ahead and play. One thing about Maiava that I think made him perhaps a more attractive backup than Gunnar Stockton. Gunnar Stockton has played 55 career snaps.
Mm-hmm.
Maiava had, I believe, 853 snaps played this past season for UNLV. And so getting an experienced backup there behind Carson Beck, I think is really, really important for Georgia moving forward. And while they like what Stockton can do, they liked what they saw in that Orange Bowl from Stockton. I think the big thing will be, is there someone, this isn't the NFL where you can go and find an experienced backup, Taylor Heineke, for example, in free agency every single year. It's tough to find those guys that have played before and are okay sitting behind someone in Carson Beck.
So where did things go wrong with Maiava? Because it was a very short time period. Do you think that he was questioning his decision before he made it, or do you think that somebody gave perhaps $1 million pitch in a span of 24 hours to get to that outcome?
I don't know about the money being thrown around, but I will say with Maiava, this is a guy that at first said when he was at UNLV, he wasn't going in the transfer portal, and then ultimately flips on that decision there. It's interesting to me that Maiava isn't the one himself who announced A, he was coming to Georgia in the first place, or B, that he was flipping from Georgia to USC. It was his agency that put out this news. And so I do think a lot of this is interesting and sort of the behind the scenes backroom dealings there. But I think with Maiava, USC is an attractive place for him to go and play. Miller Moss obviously looked great in the Holiday Bowl win over Louisville, but that's one bowl game. And Lincoln Riley, say what you want about him and his ability to coach defenses. That guy knows how to develop quarterbacks better than anyone in the sport right now. And if you're able to start for him and you're able to play for him, you're probably going to be an NFL quarterback. And so I understand with USC maybe getting its ducks in a row and getting its dollar figures in a row and aligned in a nice little briefcase. And when they make that final pitch to Maiava, as they did, I think you can see why Maiava made that decision there, because obviously, as well as Miller Moss had played, no one is saying Miller Moss is a better quarterback than Carson Beck, and there's, I think, a much easier path to the field at USC than there is at Georgia.
So in your mind, then, do you have somebody in particular that you think would be a good fit for that extra quarterback spot?
I don't, and I understand why Kirby would say what he did about having 4 scholarship quarterbacks and the want to have that there and having an experienced backup in the event that Carson Beck goes down, because if he does go down during the course of the season, it's not like this past year where you had those first 4 games that were sort of a warm-up before Carson went on the road against Auburn. I think really grew up in that win there. It's a much tougher schedule next season. And so you're going to need someone who could potentially come in and win you difficult games on the road at Texas, on the road at Ole Miss in the back half of that season. So it's hard to find someone that could potentially go out there and do it. Now, we're going to see another round of the transfer portal in April. April 16th to 29th is when that window opens. They can't be anyone within the SEC as that window has closed. And so it's just sort of maybe finding the right guy there. But I think even after Kirby Smart first made those comments in December, I had found it kind of hard to see someone who was going to fit the parameters of what Georgia was looking for. And so I ultimately wouldn't be surprised if Georgia sticks with 3 scholarship quarterbacks as they did this past season.
Now I want to go ahead and take our attention. It's time for our way too early playoff predictions. We're going to talk SEC though. 12-team playoff expansion. I know I got permission to do this. I wanted to do it last week. They said it was too soon. I got permission to do this today. So I just want to do it a little bit before we wrap up. So I guess more so my question for you is, did you put money down for Georgia to win the SEC when Nick Saban announced that he was gone?
I did not. I did have a friend who placed a wager on Georgia to win the national title last year, moments after this year's national championship ended. I know that obviously Alabama not being there, I think hurts them a little bit in terms of winning. But I think when you look at Georgia's schedule, specifically, I think they're going to play 5 of the top 20 teams next season, 4 of them in the SEC. Alabama, Texas, Ole Miss, all on the road there. It's not an easy, it's no longer Georgia playing the SEC East and they have a paved road to Atlanta. They're going to have to go out there and win some tough road games. And potentially now, maybe winning at Alabama becomes an easier task because Nick Saban's not standing on the sidelines there. That Alabama team is still going to be really, really good. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you're Georgia, can you get through that road? You have to win all your home games next year. You have to beat Tennessee at home. You have to beat Auburn at home and win those home SEC games. That's the most important thing in the SEC moving forward now. And then going on the road, you're going to have to go 3-1 in the 4 SEC road games. Ole Miss, Texas, Alabama, Kentucky. And that's as hard of a road slate as anyone is going to play, not just in the SEC, in my opinion, but in the entire country. And so with that in mind, if you get through that regular season with an 11-1 record, you're in the playoff. I think if you get through with a 10-2 record, you're probably in the playoff. But if you're in the SEC championship game with a 10-2 record and you lose that SEC championship game, then it gets maybe a little dicey if Georgia can get into the college football playoff there. I think 10-2 gets you in almost every year. But if Georgia's 11-1, as I think they can be going into next season, it's going to be so hard to go undefeated in the regular season now with what this schedule looks like and what it sets up as. If Georgia does get 12-0 through the regular season, there's part of you that wonders how important is it to really play that SEC championship game if you really do want that bye. Or do you sort of treat the SEC championship game as a mini bye and then go ahead and take the number 5 spot, and then you're playing the number 4 team and you're playing, again, the number 1 team. But I certainly think while Georgia can and is probably a bigger favorite in the SEC next season, it is by no means a guarantee that Georgia, in my mind, even makes it to Atlanta, much less actually wins.
So all season long, we heard the narrative, Georgia's schedule's too easy. Will that ever be a conversation again now that the SEC has combined?
Certainly no. And I would even say, going into the season, you heard a lot of people talk about how easy this schedule was perceived to be. You look at it at the end of the year, Georgia beat a top 10 Ole Miss team at home. They beat a top 10 Missouri team at home. They go on the road and beat a top 20 Tennessee team. They had quality opponents on there over the course of the season. Obviously, didn't look like that way at the beginning of the year, but you put that schedule out there, that's tougher than what the Big Ten played. Anyone in the Big Ten played, in my mind, certainly tougher than what Michigan had to play this season. And so, the schedule thing was always an unfair knock against Georgia. It was because that Oklahoma game got canceled, and a lot of people couldn't really figure out a way to punish Georgia for that, so they sort of did. And so I think going forward, certainly with what Georgia has in a non-conference slate, this was really the last year for a while where Georgia doesn't have, other than Georgia Tech, a marquee non-conference game. And then you add in what Georgia's going to be doing in an SEC slate every year, where you're taking South Carolina off every year, you're taking Vanderbilt off every year, and you're playing teams like Oklahoma, Texas, Alabama, LSU far more often. In a 16-team league, the idea that you're going to get an easy schedule, and there are some teams in this league next year, Missouri and Ole Miss in particular, that jump out that do have maybe a little bit softer of schedules. I find it hard to believe that Georgia's going to get that simply because the SEC wants Georgia in as many marquee games as it can, especially now with Alabama and not knowing what Alabama is going to look like moving forward. They're going to take a sure thing in Georgia and maybe give Georgia a more difficult schedule that you see on a yearly basis.
So when you look at the SEC as a whole, what is the ceiling and the floor for how many teams can get into this new 12-team playoff?
I think you could potentially see as many as 5 get in. Again, I think the big thing is going to be schedules lining up and how many 10-2 teams do you get, or do you have a team that plays a more difficult schedule and see them ultimately go 9-3. I think Missouri and Ole Miss are 2 teams that probably have to go 10-2 next year with their schedule. Whereas you look at a Texas, you look at a Georgia, Alabama obviously jumps out at there as well, LSU. If those teams go 10-2, I think that opens up the pathway there. We know there are going to be 4 conference champions in addition to the champion of the SEC. We know that there are 7 at-large spots. So the absolute most the SEC could ever get in is 8. I think there are going to be teams rising and falling, obviously, within the league, and it's going to change every year. I believe this year, if I'm doing it correctly off the top of my head, Georgia, Alabama, Missouri, and Ole Miss is the 4th team, just barely snuck in there. Would have been in a 12-team playoff this year, but obviously with Texas and Oklahoma joining the league next year, it crowds the field a little bit. You also have Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA all joining the Big Ten. That's going to make it a more crowded field in there as well. So I think it'll be interesting. I'd say on a given year, the number of SEC teams I would expect would probably be 4. And some years you might see that be 3 because it's a weaker league, like maybe it was this year, and Ole Miss was the team that snuck in at the end. They would have been the last at-large team, and then there are going to be some years where maybe you get that to 5 or 6, depending on not only what goes on in the SEC, but also what goes on in other leagues as well.
So let me ask you this: if you had to put all your Taylor Swift albums, that Michael Scott picture behind you and your Creature Comfort sweatshirt on, you had to bet it all on who was going to play for the SEC championship right now, who would be your 2 teams?
It's hard to do this without looking at a schedule and looking at all the schedules because I do think that's
I thought you were a numbers guy and you just know all the schedules off the top of your head.
Well, schedules aren't numbers.
I overestimated you.
It's more of a team thing. Yeah, you clearly did there. I would say Georgia's probably the team I feel safest betting on, just betting on the pedigree, the talent that they have there. Texas might be interesting, but Texas is going to be a team. They're going to be ranked in the top 5 next year. Quinn Ewers announces he's coming back today. They lose a lot on their defensive line. They lose a lot at wide receiver. And I think going forward, those are 2 tough positions that are hard to reload on a one-year thing. You've seen that with Georgia, obviously, I think this season and then the 2019 season when it comes to the wide receiver position. So I think Texas might be a popular pick, but I would maybe slow that down a little bit, especially with the fact that they're moving up a league and you're not playing at Texas Tech, a TCU, a Kansas State where you're more talented every week. You're playing LSU's, Oklahoma's, Alabama's there as well. If I had to pick a second team, I'm going to say Ole Miss, even though they lose Quinshon Judkins. I think with what Lane does on the offensive side of the ball, I think with the schedule that they get to play, I know they have to play at Georgia at home. I think they go on the road to Oklahoma. But I think with the schedule that they don't play Alabama, they don't play LSU, they don't play Texas, they get Georgia at home. And with the talent that they have there, they're going to be able to score points. That's something Lane Kiffin has always done. And they've put in a lot of resources into shoring up that defense, bringing Walter Nolan, the edge rusher from Florida, whose name I'll never be able to say, and I'm glad he is not a Georgia Bulldog. They have made a real effort to beef up that defense, and so I think they're going to be able to do enough, along with the fact that I think they play either the weakest or the second weakest schedule in the SEC next season. I think you're going to see Georgia and Ole Miss play on November 9th, and then I think you're going to see Georgia and Ole Miss play again in the SEC championship game. And in the event that I do lose my wonderful Michael Scott print, my Creature Comfort sweatshirt, I can just go out and buy him again.
Okay, well, that's no fun. I do want the Michael Scott. I've got a perfect place in my apartment to hang it, so I'm going to go ahead and hold you to that now. Here's the thing, though. Only time will tell, but as we've learned, even though we're in the offseason, it's going to fly by so fast, and it's going to be here before we know it. I'm really looking forward to this new era of college football, this new era of the SEC, and certainly excited to see who Alabama is going to put in this very, very important role. Connor, DawgNation audience, thank you for joining us for another DawgNation Post Season Special. We will see you guys right here next week on the pages of DawgNation, so make sure to check it out. Everybody, thank you for joining us, and go rejoice in Nick Saban's retirement as long as you can. I know I'll be having a Coke and an oatmeal cream pie tonight in his honor and in honor of the dog. So thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you right back here next week at 7 o'clock.